So today we're going to talk about fear, trauma, and prediction error. First, I'm going to talk about the biology of fear a little bit. Then we're going to talk about kind of trauma and prediction error together with fear. To lay the groundwork, one, I am painting over an original painting, and two, the great thing about me doing this is you can tell if this is my second time trying to film something. So I'm going to be painting while speaking. Please feel free to grab a creative expression, or even if you're listening while you're working out, that's great. Whatever works for you. We are going to talk about a pretty heavy subject because I think fear and trauma are heavy in general because they're disruptions to our system, or not fear, but trauma is a disruption to our system. So please feel free to have something handy for expression if you feel something come up for you. Or if this is just your way of having creative time, please use it because that's really, really important. Okay, so we're gonna get into an emotion, but first I want to talk a little bit about what emotions are. So I think anytime we're talking about emotions, whether it's fear, love, there's so many of them, but we're just going to stick with fear and love because those are the ones I think are really interesting. So whether it's fear, which is more of an adrenaline type response, or love, which is more of a serotonergic, oxytocin, especially long term, oxytocin, vasopressin kind of response, or addiction, which is a dopaminergic response, because we've got that pursuit going on. And you can actually have dopamine in the beginning stages of love because you're pursuing, right? Anyway, anytime we're talking about those emotions, I think it's really important to understand that we have these things that we call them, but ultimately they're just different states of arousal. And we've got scientists, researchers who have mapped areas of the brain and body that respond to what people have said is the emotion that they're feeling. However, we all have different thresholds for different emotions. We all have different ways that we process those emotions, and we have different ways that we interpret the signaling. So there are people who could experience fear, but because they've learned to internalize it, interpret it as a challenge, it's just a state of heightened arousal where they know, let me channel this a certain way, right? There are other people who that very same arousal response would cause that, just the thought of I could have it, like, could cause them to feel like they are afraid to leave the house. Those are two extremes. I think most people sit somewhere in the middle. I know I do. There are certain things that scare me, but I can kind of channel that fear of, I got to move forward in this and use it to grow, right? And there are other things where it might actually stop me in my tracks and I'm like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to. So we have most people have a spectrum of responses to these arousal states. Also, context is really important to those arousal states. So I do get a fear feeling when I have to talk, when I have to speak in front of people, especially webinars, and actually when I'm on mic anytime in front of people, which happens on a weekly basis at this point. But when I have that kind of stuff happen, I do have an initial fear of, and then what I found is that I just kind of dial in and use that response mechanism that I understand now to power through it. And I've learned that it's progress, not perfection, which also helps. But we all are going to be on that spectrum. So there are some great books, like Sapiens really talks about the anthropological history of humanity, which is cool. I've mentioned Joseph Campbell's book on the hero's journey, which really illustrates how important narrative is to our brains and how we process the world. There's The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, which is a really good book. I don't it's been a while since I read that one. I don't remember if he specifically speaks on language, but I do believe that there is a section where there's a discussion about concepts. And so anytime we're talking about words, and he does talk about words. So anytime we're talking about words, and emotions included, because we have labels, right? Fear, love, hatred, anger, this, that, joy, sadness. We're choosing as a collective to have a shared word or term, and I'm only using English. There are, in other languages, they might have 5 different ways to describe love. One is familial, one is romantic, one is platonic, right? We have shared communal words that we understand due to context of having been taught this is what this means. And different communities and different communities you might grow up in, and by community it could be as small as like your family, is going to teach a slightly varied version of what that is. So anytime we're doing a study and asking people to self-report, what are you feeling, it's going to be based on the context of what they've learned up to that point, and then also whatever definition the researchers might choose to give them. So I think that when it comes to research, it's really important to understand that there's some variability there, and we can only measure what we can measure, right? So all that being said, getting really broad and philosophical with that. I like getting philosophical and scientific at the same time. But I also think that when we're reading research, it's important to understand that all research, even the best studies, philosophically, they're based off of shared understanding, and there's going to be variation. So even the best laid plans are going to have variation to results. And there might be some deviation between what you feel and what other people feel based on your concept. And also, everyone's arousal patterns are different. When we think about things like depression and anxiety, OCD, stuff like that, and OCD is under the anxiety category. But when we think about bipolar disorder, borderline personality, all of these things, they're tied to often emotions in some way, right? And so there's a skew towards certain dysregulation in different arousal patterns, or lack of arousal, low arousal patterns. And if we can understand some of those mechanisms, if we can understand that naturally we're all going to kind of vibe in a different area, and that's okay. It's about living your life the way that you really want to live it, showing up in the way that you want to show up. That gives us some freedom, I think, to better understand ourselves and see where we need to make lifestyle adjustments. So, all right, all of that being said, and that was a lot of lead in, let's talk about just the very basic, and I'm sure that there's research that says that there's more going on, but I'm going to go with the very, very, very basic what happens when we experience fear. So when we experience fear, and it's important to note, this is whether it is actually happening. So you're walking down a path, your body or your brain makes your brain, because your eyes are just part of your brain, sees what you know is a poisonous snake in front of you. So whether that's what happens, or you're at home preparing for a Zoom meeting in a couple of days, you know that your ex-spouse is going to be on the call, or to-be ex-spouse is going to be on the call, because let's say it's a mediation call, and you just don't know what line of BS they're going to say, on the call. Or you have a big speech that you're going to give the next day or weeks from now, and it's really important to you because it's for someone that you really care about and you want it to be impactful, right? It doesn't have to be that something negative is going on, but we know that the context of what we're facing is scary, or we're having fear about the public speaking. We're having fear about the person who, maybe that ex-spouse, there's trauma there, right? Maybe you both had, in some way, acted negatively towards one another. So there's this feeling of, what if they do it again? Because as we'll talk about when we get to prediction error. And as we have already talked about, if you watch the video on mental mapping and mental modeling, we've created versions of people based on our previous experiences. And so what we anticipate happening is based on those previous experiences. So whether it's anticipatory or literally in front of us, there is the serious potential for danger, right? Because that snake hasn't bit me, but I see it and I know it's poisonous. Our body, our brains, will have a fear response. And so that fear response happens in a couple of places. And we're going to talk about first the hippocampus. So the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex will have an impact on our memory and our decision-making process. So when people talk about eyewitness testimony not being the best and that it's malleable, that's because our decision-making process and our memory process has been compromised. I don't want to say impaired, because actually if you're undergoing a stress response, you might be able to learn something new a lot faster, better, and deeper than you would have without that stress response. So it really depends on the situation as to how it's affected, but it is those areas are affected. And then the amygdala releases stress hormones and it triggers the sympathetic nervous system. So we end up with epinephrine, adrenaline pumping through our system. So we end up with shortness of breath, rapid heart rate, butterflies in the stomach, our non-absolute necessary organ shut down, which means our digestive system. We have reduced hearing, tunnel vision, dilation of pupils. So there's a lot going on in the body, which is what we traditionally would think of as that fight or flight response. We're like, oh, gotta go, right? And there's actually, and they talk about it in a lot of books now related to trauma: flight, fright, freeze, and even potentially please. The freeze and please states tend to be later down the line, so they don't necessarily appear, in infancy as a response. Not that an infant would anyway. Those are more learned behaviors. We learned that if we stop deer in the headlights, then we might not have to deal with that. Or if we please, and that's especially a learned behavior, if we please the person who we're afraid of, then we'll be quote unquote safe. You're never really safe in that situation, but we learn that. So there's some different responses that can happen after that fear response. Now, again, in a short-term scenario, fear and or a stress response where we've got that adrenaline, epinephrine, pumping through us, that could be great for athletic performance. If you psych yourself up and think about things like pupils dilating, that your breathing, increasing, that hyper focus, that can be great for especially a fight. If you're in martial arts and you're about to do something, if you're in combat, there is some information out there to say that it could help with like our ability to absorb the information that's around us, right? So if you're a student and you've got to cram and you've got to get an A or a B or something on this test and you only have a couple of days and you have to get in there and really hyper focus, that fear response of, if I don't get a passing grade, I'm out, that could actually assist. Sometimes people, they're really struggling to find a job, and so then the fear response sets in, and I'm saying a lot, I apologize. So the fear response sets in, they end up applying to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 jobs in just a few days, right? Because they're hyper-focusing and they're able to do that, and then they're able to figure things out. A lot can be said for the fear response in and of itself. Sometimes we might deflect a comment from someone because we're just so on the ball in the moment that our automatic kind of nature to self-preservate self-preserve and say something witty might come out, right? It's not necessarily that this fear response is the worst thing in the world. If you're into extreme hobbies, like jumping out of a plane, that fear response is going to save your life. If you rock climb without any equipment and you have a slight slip, but your reflex grabs you, that just saved you. So fear in and of itself it is a neutral, like pretty much all of the emotions, right? And what can make the fear response and other emotional responses, whether it's anger, which I would say tends to be pretty tied to fear, or sadness, which also can be tied to fear, if any of those, the values of positive or negative that we put on them is really based on our society. Each emotion in and of itself contextually could actually be really healthy. So when we're thinking about trauma though, part of trauma is obviously a fear response. And as I said briefly before, when we have a fear response, it can heighten our ability to take in information because we're hyper-focusing. So an example would be, and I apologize if this is triggering for you or bothers you, but this is probably the easiest scenario for me to explain the chain of events. And it's one of my like real traumas that will, I think, illustrates what happens pretty well. So when we have a traumatic event, and my example will be when I was sexually assaulted as a kid, we then have a fear response. So for me, I was a kid, I went to school, had to go to church because I went to Catholic school. That's not out of the ordinary. For many, many years, that's what my prediction would be, today's going to be a normal day. And if anything, I actually don't have to do schoolwork for a couple of hours because we're going to have this mass service, right? So my arousal system would have been very, very low, just expecting this is what this is. Then I went into the reconciliation room because there were so many students that were going through reconciliation that we had to be not just in the booths, but in the Sunday school rooms where there wasn't a divider, and sexual behavior happened that was inappropriate. So raped as a kid, and that would mean that in that moment, everything that was happening, every sound, everything I could see when my eyes were open, everything that I tasted, touched, sensed, was entangled in my memory with an experience that was highly traumatic, that made my sense of safety in the world get completely disrupted, right? This happens for people in a variety of ways. It could be abuse at home, and it doesn't have to be sexual. It could be emotional. It could be verbal. It could be physical. This can happen when people are on the other side and they're kind of forced, or they have a feeling of being forced to commit what could be considered like a heinous kind of act. My grandfather, who was like my dad, he was in the military and he was a sniper, and so he wrestled with the amount of people that he killed. I think for a long time he found some peace in A Course of Miracles, but when we think of that war PTSD, it was his job, like he was sanctioned, and this is his job, and he's doing it to keep the people he quote unquote loves safe, and this is for the country, and this, but it doesn't make that kind of action towards another person any easier on the psyche. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be a feeling of guilt or remorse. It there's always this, we talked about cognitive dissonance. I always felt this kind of cognitive dissonance, this weirdness with loving my grandfather so much because he did help raise me, but then knowing that he took away the loved ones of other people. That kind of trying to understand this super, by the time I was born, this very peaceful, calm, soft, kind soul capable of that kind of behavior. And he was a two-time Golden Gloves boxer. Like, he was a tough guy. And he had a chip on his shoulder because he had a lot of trauma that he grew up in. But just that difference in the person that I knew versus the behaviors that could come out, that really, I think that contextualized for me that people, one, we do change, and two, we're capable of both astronomically positive and negative behaviors depending on the situation and what it calls for. But I know for him, that was actually, those behaviors were traumatizing for him. And I can't imagine, how traumatizing it was to whoever was left behind from whoever was impacted by his behaviors. It's, rough to think about. But the point is, this is going in an odd direction, sorry. The point is, all of the stimuli that he would have taken in when he was committing those acts later would impact him, and so I was lucky he had, by the time I came around, had dealt with his trauma in that way. So he wasn't someone who ever responded out of anger due to hearing a bang or seeing a facial expression that reminded him of someone that he did what he did to, right? That wasn't a thing. But I think when he was younger, and some people who are veterans go through this, he had an alcohol problem. He was definitely an alcoholic. He smoked. There were addiction issues that he worked through his 30s and 40s, right? So I think it's important to note that trauma is a disruption to our system, and sometimes it happens in weird ways, and we can feel guilty, actually. And I will say, and this sounds really weird, and maybe only someone else who's experienced that kind of child sexual trauma, or maybe it's because it was religious in nature and the position that a priest holds in the church, or maybe it's a power dynamic, I don't know, but I know for a long time I felt a feeling of guilt. So I do think that trauma sometimes leaves us with this inherent feeling of guilt, and it could be because we didn't protect ourselves. It could be because we didn't stand up for what we thought was right. It could be any number of things, but true trauma is complex, and I think part of it is because we have that fear response. We take in all the information about the context for which the situation that is jolting to us is happening, and then anytime one of those stimuli is kind of predicted, so we think it's going to be there, or we experience it, we can be transported back to the situation where we were traumatized and relive those emotions if we don't process them in a healthy way. So we could have hundreds of stimuli we don't even realize, sounds, tastes, touches, even just what we're wearing at the time, the feeling of that on our skin could later impact us as we're trying to navigate the world. And we could end up acting out in ways that are protective. We think they're protective because they're based on what we've learned is protective, but ultimately it doesn't actually work. So it's harmful to self. So an example of that would be after what happened to me happened, or what I experienced happened. So at the school that I went to, we had to go to church weekly, but we only had to do reconciliation a few times a year, right? So every week after that happened for at least a year, and it might have happened longer if I wouldn't have gotten put on like antacids, but before I would have the day that I had to go to church, and it changed based on the year you were in school and the year and how they formatted it. But let's say that I had church on a Wednesday. That Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, I would feel sick to my stomach. I would be heaving sometimes, and ultimately I did end up going to the doctor, and they did a test to see if I had an ulcer, which I didn't. No one ever checked for trauma at that time. Just like, really? Looking back, being a psychology practitioner, I'm like, why did no one ever link these things? But anyway, so my brain was making a prediction error. It was predicting that if I went back to that church for service, that would be what happened to me again. Now, intellectually, even at that age, I think you could have asked me, because I was like 11, 12, you could have asked me and I would have told you that the chances of that happening were like 0 because of what I just stated, because even I understood. But my body just knew and anticipated and made the prediction that we're going back to this place, this could happen, right? That would be like for my grandfather, if you have a gun in your hand, you're going to have to shoot someone. That wouldn't necessarily be correct. He could be at a firing range where there's just targets, no one's getting injured, but that could have been something. He was very much a pacifist as he got older, so I doubt that that's likely. But that could have been a fear. Anyway, point is, when we have trauma, we then connect all of those things. We end up with fear. That could happen if you grow up in abuse. If you grow up in abuse, then it might be that your expectation, especially if it goes on and on and on, might be that any interaction with a male, or if you watch a parent get abused, and I'm saying male because I'm a female, and I'm thinking about like that male-female relationship, but it could be a male-male, female-female, or a female abusing the male, because that does happen and it gets underreported. So if you grow up watching intimate partner violence, then it could be that your brain now sees relationships as unsafe. That's what happens, and so it's better to either stay out of them, or you tend to enter, it can happen that you enter violent situations anyway, because that's what we are used to. So a part of prediction, so our brains run on prediction. I kind of talked about this a little bit, or at least I alluded to it in the mental models. We take in the world, we take in stimuli. When we're afraid, we take in we hyper-focus and take in everything going on. When we're traumatized, we really latch on to that, and now we've created an emotional dysregulation that continues until we process the emotions and the fear related to the stimuli from the incidents and uncouple it so that we change our perception of the stimuli, right? So I had to learn to feel safe in churches again. I'm not super practicing of any religion. I do meditate, and I am a spiritual person, and I believe in oneness, like unity consciousness, stuff like that. But I would say that I tend to steer away from traditional Western churches, but I can go into one, and I actually went back to the church where it happened as an adult just to kind of uncouple that. For a while, I actually got my bachelor's degree in metaphysics, and I opted for a bit to be an ordained minister just to prove, I think, to myself, to uncouple, like, spiritual people or people who are in that position can be safe, right? So we all have things that we have to uncouple. For a long time, it was hard for me to even be spiritual because I had coupled religion with spirituality and also religion with being unsafe. So we have our own things that we categorize together. So I say couple because we can uncouple one thing at a time, allowing ourselves to feel safe with whatever it is. but we might have a category of unsafe things based on one traumatic event or a series of traumatic events. So there is something called CPTSD, which is complex PTSD, occurring from a series of us having a prolonged fear response due to what you could call a series of unsafe or traumatizing instances. And honestly, I think most people who have experienced CPTSD, because I would say that I'm in that bracket due to home life, there can actually be separate instances of trauma outside of the ongoing potential family trauma or household trauma. It doesn't even have to be family. It could be communal trauma. But if you were raised in a home that was there where there was abuse, so you can look at the ACEs to kind of measure what kind of traumatic instances might have occurred. If you were in a household where a parent was taken out, if you're in a household where there was addiction, where there was abuse, verbal, physical, mental, emotional, social, financial, all of those things impact and to a certain degree impair our ability to regulate, maneuver, and understand the world. As we get older, we can make the choice to learn the things that we probably should have learned in childhood, to try to better and deepen our understanding of the world that we live in, and to create a safe environment for ourselves, both internally and externally. It does take work and learning how to regulate our own nervous system. So, all that being said, what does that have to do with probability error? So, there's a great book, How Emotions Are Made. I already mentioned that. But when we think about how she talks about it, and I think it's great. When we think about people, we are at our core scientists, right? Or researchers, or whatever you want to call it. But our brain is set up to take all the information that we've gathered throughout our life so far, however long that might be, create a mental model of the world and how we should act within it. And then on an ongoing basis, it creates models, and also it runs analysis on what is likely to happen, how it's likely to happen, and what we should do based statistically on how likely a certain outcome is that we want, right? So an error occurs when we have a mismatch. What we think is likely to occur based on what we've been exposed to is highly incorrect. So let's say that we've been exposed to only our local community, right? So someone who hasn't really traveled, hasn't really explored the world, whether you're from urban or rural, you only know the type of people that you've been surrounded by, and you've been surrounded by the same type of people throughout your life. Okay. On a global scale, or even a United States scale, on a country scale, you might experience a lot of errors, because the only perspective you really have, and the only exposure you really had, is to your local community. And people just within the same state, let alone the country and the world, there are so many distinct communities, so many distinct cultures. At the core of it, we're all humans, but our cultural norms, our understandings, our spectrums, like, they're different. So the more we experience, the broader our mental model is, and the more we have space to anticipate what's likely to occur. So people who are lifelong learners, people who really try to just continue to expand their library of understanding, whether it's broadly or they have areas of focus that are really interesting to them, can make those over time, or maybe even if they're naturally inclined, make those connections to better understand what's going on, and it broadens their ability to map out what's likely to occur. So when we have trauma, we could say that trauma kind of acts as this weird filter to our ability to project what's likely to occur in a healthy way, which can cause for dysregulation because we might anticipate that negative events are all or more highly likely to occur than positive ones. So now we've got this filter on the world that is, sometimes it can even be that other people's intentions is this or that, and those intentions are negative. And it makes us act reactionarily. It makes us act out of a fear state. And we might sit, and then we perpetuate the fear. So because we've acted in a fear state, we continue to act in a fear state because it's all that we really know. And now, as I said towards the beginning, our emotions are kind of on a spectrum, but they're based off of our internal systems and what we're used to experiencing and what we have the capacity to experience. So if we've only really experienced trauma and fear, then we're going to have a natural inclination to stay in that range of arousal because that's what feels comfortable, that's what feels familiar, that's what our brain can predict. It knows how to operate within those patterns. But if we want to live a life that's not based on that doesn't have all this disruption, that is based on, calm or love or whatever pattern we want to switch to, there is going to be a feeling of fear and also a feeling of discomfort. And that discomfort isn't coming from the fact that love or a healthy relationship is uncomfortable. It's not coming from the fact that a job where we are able to make enough money to take care of ourselves is uncomfortable. It's not coming from the fact that those things inherently are bad. And we might self-sabotage actually because that feeling of everything is okay. I'm not aroused. I'm not feeling that arousal state of fear is so foreign to us that we can feel a sense of withdrawal. We can feel a sense of, what am I supposed to do now? Right? Our homeostasis has been in fear, or our homeostasis has been in a perpetual state of trauma. So it's really up to us to figure out, where do we want to shift? How much can we shift? How rapidly to change our arousal pattern from something of fear-based to maybe love-based, or fear-based to just contentness, or fear to whatever. And that doesn't mean that fear, the emotion, or it doesn't mean that fear, the arousal pattern goes away completely, because fear, like I said towards the beginning, it's kept us alive. It's important. We wouldn't ever want to live without any arousal pattern of fear. But what we want to do is uncouple our perceptions of what causes that fear. What we want to do is take those daily things like talking to people, if that's something that scares us or causes fear, but is something that we need to do. It's learning how to uncouple the fear with the behaviors that are necessary for a happy, healthy life. And a lot of those fear patterns happen in childhood. So it could be, and this is kind of like, I would say almost a trope at this point, but when we think about historically for females, there might have been a fear culturally in the United States, and I don't know about other countries. It's going to be dependent potentially on your region alone, let alone the country itself. But females used to be very much at home taken care of by the male. So it could be that we, due to watching what we watched growing up in our families and society, have a fear of standing on our own, taking care of ourselves. And it's not a conscious fear, but maybe it's a subconscious fear where it feels like that would be unsafe or unlovable if we're not going to be taken care of. If we might have had a disrupted childhood where there was a lot of trauma, there was a lot of just not really being taken care of, we could have the opposite, where we learn to take care of ourselves so young that we have a fear of letting anyone else take care of us. And it doesn't even have to be physically taking care of us, like providing for us, but it could be we have a fear of emotionally allowing others in, even though biologically humans thrive in a sense of community and connection with one another. We really need that. It's ingrained in our DNA to be happy when we're in community with other people, whatever that means for your system. It could be a lot of people, a little people, but we thrive from that. So we make these prediction errors about what's likely to happen. This can happen. I was listening to the Huberman Lab podcast. They were talking about happiness, and I thought it was interesting because they were talking about introverts and extroverts and prediction patterns for introverts when they're going to potentially go into a situation where they're going to be with other people versus extroverts, and introverts having a higher reported bias towards thinking that it's going to be uncomfortable and then reporting afterwards that it actually wasn't that bad, whereas extroverts are less likely to have quite the this is going to be not fun. They might not be all the way on the spectrum of I'm going to love this, but they're more likely to be open to it. So all that is to say that we might inherently have a prediction error, right? I'm an extrovert. I know that when I'm actually around people, I'm going to feel a lot better. I'm going to feel excited. I'm going to feel that sense of, oof, I'm good. But the longer I go without being around people, the more my prediction error actually tends to come up. And then I'm going to predict that I'm not going to have fun going out and being around people. The minute that I'm about to leave, if I was asked the same question, I'd be like, that was so great. I love being with people. But the longer the instance between that social interaction, the more likely I am to kind of be like, well, I don't know. So it seems like introverts might be more likely to have a prediction error that communing with other people is going to be painful and uncomfortable, but immediately after the fact, they actually realize, especially in smaller groups. Now, I'm not saying that I would have to look at the study, but I doubt that they took introverts and put them in groups of like 30, 50, 80 people. But in general, could be that introverts make prediction errors based off of, or prediction errors when in reality they're going to really enjoy a smaller gathering of people. But again, that was just something that I thought was interesting. So we make prediction errors. That's what we do as people. That's how this happens. But trauma can really, really skew the errors that we make. And it can become something that rules our life if we don't process the emotions related to those traumas. And trauma is ultimately like this very strong fear response to a situation that might be very much non-normal or non-typical. Also, so I think that there probably is a lot more household trauma, or at least when I was a kid, there's probably a lot more household trauma than I realized. By that, I just mean people growing up in families that were dysfunctional and inherently, because of patterns passed down from generation to generation, caused their own, again, arousal version of trauma. But we have some control as we grow up in moving the needle on our arousal patterns. We have some space to say, I grew up in an environment that was highly dysfunctional, so I have these particular proclivities or addictions to certain behaviors, whatever they might be. It could be attachment and love, or the idea of love. It could be excitement. It could be an actual substance. It could be eating, whatever it is, right? So you might have grown up in dysfunction, whatever that looks like for you and your family, or the household you are in, or community. We might have gravitated towards certain things to try to escape, but really that just created this pattern of addiction, which I will talk about addiction in another video. But we get to choose whether we further that, whether we continue that pattern of arousal seeking through whatever means it might be. We get to choose whether we only feel comfortable in patterns that are unsafe. And I know that sounds like, but you don't get to choose. But you do. It takes time, it takes dedication, it takes self-care practices, quite honestly. So things like meditation, regular exercise to regulate our nervous systems, maybe yoga to kind of flex out our bodies and allow for that space, creative expression to allow for those feelings to get out or to address what maybe we haven't previously. Therapy, groups, workbooks, whatever really speaks to you is what's going to help you move from one arousal state to the next. I used to be very much like I had to have drama. There had to be something going on. I think at the time I really did love case management work when I did it, partially because I really do gravitate towards health and how to help people, and I love health policy and interventions and ways to try to improve life circumstances for everybody, right? That being said, when you're on the ground, you're dealing with everyone's stuff all the time, and that's kind of the position that I grew up in. And so walking away from that and deciding it's not the pattern I want to keep living every day. For other people, they might be able to go into case management and that's not what gets triggered for them. Maybe they had a really great, stable upbringing, and so they can handle that kind of arousal in a different way and it works for them. For me, it wasn't my thing. I imagine that in every occupation, there are people who go into that occupation and it makes a lot of sense for them and their arousal patterns based on what they were raised in an unhealthy way. And then for others, it makes a lot of sense based on what they were raised in a healthy way. Some things can exacerbate our tendencies to play certain roles that might not be healthy for us, and others might cause us to elevate ourselves to the highest level that we can be. I find for me, I gravitate when I'm more in my higher self or acting more in alignment with my natural nature. It's more research. I love research. And that is a way for me to really bring my curiosity to the table and synthesize and create materials that take what was learned and allow it to be available to other people, but without me having the responsibility of care. Because that responsibility of care for me was of reliving of that stress, right? We all have our different things. And so no judgment on yours, but definitely understand that fear is a neutral thing. It's what's kept the human bodies alive. Trauma is a disruption to something that is pretty neutral becoming pretty extreme and us taking in a lot of information and then trying to contextualize it. And things like emotional dysregularity, PTSD, complex PTSD come up when there was a traumatic experience and we weren't able to re-regulate, and so now we're holding on to all of those patterns and it's affecting our daily lives in some way. And then I promise I will get this correct. But when we're thinking about errors, especially in this way, prediction errors, they can be clouded by our trauma. They can be clouded by that emotional dysregularity so that we're unable to come up with or open ourselves up to the possibility of living in a different way. And pursuing that in a way that is healthy versus a pursuit based on previous experiences and regulations. So hopefully, all of that was a lot. I know I tried to condense it into 50 minutes. It was a lot. Hopefully it was helpful. I share my lived experiences related to trauma, not because, it is purely to give an example of how these things can work and how they can manifest and affect us. I've been really fortunate to have therapy be a part of my life for various reasons, from a very early age, from like 15 or 14, something like that. So I've been fortunate to get to work through a lot of my stuff and find coping skills that work for me. Very fortunate to have the ability to work through my stuff and to have found community in a way that's meaningful. So I just hope that if you're watching this, if any of that resonates, if you're like, I didn't have that exact trauma, but that's how I felt after this happened, please look for local resources. Please look for local groups. You can look for national groups. So depending on what you identify with as far as trauma, there are virtual groups that you can talk to other people who have similar trauma patterns or similar histories. And a magical thing can happen. So when we have trauma and we talk to other people who have similar trauma or who have been impacted by similar behaviors of dysfunction, a great thing can happen where we can see that we're not alone. We can see that there's a possibility for a different outcome, and it broadens our mental map of what is possible, which is great. Also, if it's done in an unhealthy way, it can become an echo chamber of more fear mongering and this is what's wrong and so we can excuse each other's behaviors instead of holding each other accountable. I highly suggest, well, one, you are where you are in your journey, so you're going to go into whatever groups you go into and you're going to get whatever you can get out of them based on where you're at. No judgment-free zone. So that's one. And two, I highly encourage people to hold themselves and each other accountable in those spaces with love and kindness, because I know that I slip up. I don't know anyone that doesn't. We all have times where we make a choice that is out of alignment with who we know we are, with what we know we want, and we do it out of fear, we do it out of this feeling of urgency, we do it out of old patterning and programming, we do it for any number of different reasons. Ultimately, what's most important is that we get back on whatever path it is we know brings us more joy, or at least contentedness, so that we can radiate that out into the world. Because fear begets fear, because we act out of fear, we act out of survival, we act out of trauma, we hurt others, hurt people, loving people, love people. So whenever we can hold space to be more loving, that's really what we want to do, or at least content and calm, so that when we're hit with those people who just want to feel that excitement or drama or that whirlwind, whatever, we can kind of be our own center of peace. So good luck. If any of this resonated with you, I feel for you. And I hope that this was helpful. I hope that something hit, or something makes a little bit more sense, either about your own behavior, about someone you care about's behavior, about life patterns. Yeah. So thanks for listening. Thanks for potentially creating with me or doing something to kind of relieve whatever's going on in your body. Take care of yourself. Because when we take care of ourselves, we can radiate care out to others. So thanks.